Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer. I've been having a look in my book Tales of Olde Sussex by Philip Mercer, which was published in 1834. It's wet and horrible outside today, and I thought I would give you another story from Philip Mercer's work. And this is the story of the pirate of Arundel. So here it is. I'll relate it rather than reading it to you. I'll relate it in more modern English, because that was published right at the end of the Georgian period, and it relates to a story of John Grayson, who apparently was a pirate and had sailed, I don't know, the seven seas and all the different places that pirates sail, and had suffered a number of injuries, but the biggest injury he had in his piratical work was the removal of a leg, whether it had been blown away or a piece of falling mast or something had hit it. It doesn't really say, but we know that he had a wooden leg, like all pirates, I suppose, are supposed to have. And at the end of his piracy in his 50s, he retired from his mariner life and came to Arundel. And it's said that he came with a sea chest, like many of the seagoing people had, that was stuffed with money. And he seems to have been a character who was quite happy to flaunt that money, for in Arundel he would be seen drinking with the rich and the famous, the noblemen, the merchants and all the others, and splashing the cash, I guess, as they say, making sure that everybody knew who he was and that he was a person to be reckoned with. And it seems that he'd had a pretty jolly life, telling stories of his daring do's on the seven seas. Well, as time progressed, it seems that he retired from Arundel to a small cottage in North Stoke. South Stoke. South Stoke. And now there's North Stoke and South Stoke very close to Arundel, just slightly to the north, on the bend of the River Arun. And you've got South Stoke on the south side of the River Arun, and you've got North Stoke on the north side. And it seems that John Grayson had managed to get himself a job in his sort of retirement years as a ferryman. And it was quite a useful task having a ferry, because at the time the nearest bridges were in Arundel and at Houghton, and the two communities of North Stoke and South Stoke would want to get down to Arundel, because it was at that time still a port, and a lot of big ships would have come in there, and the farmers would want to get their stuff to market, and it's easier to load it up on the ferry and take it across. I mean, the ferry was not much more than a glorified rowing boat, but you could still get a wagon load of stuff from one side to the other. And it seems that even though he had a wooden leg, John Grayson managed to run this operation quite okay for many years. And he lived in this tiny little cottage. And I guess he took I don't know how he got paid, but he either took the money from the people or a portion of the money or whatever it was. But as he got older and his seafaring ways were getting against his health, he was a lot more unreliable. He would drink. Some mornings he wouldn't get up. People would be waiting for the ferry and he hadn't turned up. There would be complaints, and his character, as old age and the hardships of life went against him, changed quite dramatically. And he was pretty much disliked as he got into his mid to late 60s, and he kept himself to himself. But there was a story that he had a relationship with a woman in South Stoke, in the village, although she denied this and kept well clear of him. But it said that there was a boy from this woman that she'd given birth to this boy. And as he grew up, when he was in his 6th, 7th and 8th year, he used to go and see John and help him, running errands and doing a few jobs for him. And but that all sort of changed. The old man became more irascible and unlikable and set in his ways. And eventually, it seems that the complaints were too much, and this job was coming to an end. But it so happened that the lords of the manor, and probably the Duke of Richmond, I would imagine, because much of the land then was owned by the Duke of, was it Richmond or Norfolk? The Duke of Norfolk, I think it was. The Duke of Richmond was Chichester. The Duke of Norfolk probably was responsible for a bridge, that there is now a bridge. If you go there to South Stoke, there is a bridge across the river. And because of that, the farmers had no more need of the ferry. And so this boat would stay at the back in the little garden at the back of the cottage down by the river there. And nobody really saw much of John Grayson at all. But at some point, he could no longer afford the rent. And even though people thought that he still had money in his chest, he was getting forgetful. And maybe this was the early signs of dementia, who knows? But people suspected that he was just such a miser that he refused to pay the rent even though he had the money. But eventually, he was told to leave, and he was ousted from the house, evicted. And at some point he does leave this house, and he gathered what small items that he had together of personal belongings. And it seems that he got the ferry back in the water, even though it must have been pretty dilapidated at this point. And he had some contact, it's believed, up in Pulborough, perhaps his only friend. And he was going to row himself upriver. Now, it's a fast-flowing river, the Arun, and that's quite a distance. It's probably, I'm not quite sure, it's probably about 6-7 miles, something like that. But anyway, he was going to row himself up the river and take with him his sea chest. Now, there were plenty of people who had upset during this time, and it seems that there were a gang of labourers who were out to get him, and very curious as to what was in the sea chest, convinced that there was still a fortune to be had. So as John Grayson manages to get all his stuff loaded up into his ferry and starts the arduous journey of going upriver, these labourers get into another boat and are there to hijack him. Now, the water, the river around that neck of the woods is quite windy before you get up to Houghton Bridge. And well before there, these labourers were hiding in the reeds and the bulrushes of the bank for him to come round a corner in a very deserted part of the landscape. And there they suddenly pushed out on their boat with big stout sticks that they had cut from the trees all around. And then they asked him, or demanded, that he hand over his sea chest. Well, John, was being this old sea dog, still had that instinct to fight, and he wasn't going to give up easily. But he looked around for a weapon, and he had none. So the only thing he could do was he unstrapped his wooden leg and grabbed hold of it, I imagine by the ankle of your wooden leg, and started brandishing it about, threatening anyone who came near him that he would whack them hard. Well, there were 3 or 4 in this other boat, the labourers, and they were younger and fitter, and they soon came alongside, and within the struggle they grabbed hold of his leg, this wooden leg, and threw it towards the bank, where it also landed in the reeds and the grasses and the bulrushes and all of that. And he was defenceless, and but he was not going to give up, and he clung to his sea chest, desperate not to get shot of it or to let it go. And it seems that in that struggle the boat rocked, and somehow or other he fell overboard, which isn't hard to imagine in a very unsteady, unseaworthy ferry. And as I mentioned before, the River Arun is a very fast flowing river. In fact, I believe it's the fastest flowing river in the country. And his body was swept away pretty hastily. And although it is said at the trial that the men did try to retrieve him and rescue him, he had gone too far too quickly. Whether they did or not is a moot point, really, because they still grabbed hold of the sea chest, loaded it into their boat, and abandoned the ferry, which eventually pulled up somewhere on the bank, and they got away with their trunk. Well, at some point, somewhere, they opened this trunk, and inside they discovered that there was not as much wealth as they and everybody else had imagined. There was a moth-eaten hammock, a pewter plate, a leather mug or tankard, I think, and a few other little trinkets here and there, but really none of it amounted to any wealth whatsoever. There was a few items of clothing as well, which he must have been wearing, an old, not tailcoat, but a frock coat that perhaps in his days when he would swagger on board a pirate ship with his shipmates, that he would wear. So nothing very much. Now, unfortunately, the body of John Grayson did wash up on the bank and was found very quickly, and it could see that he had bruises and bashes where he'd been beaten. And it was known that these guys were on their boat and they'd been spotted. And so I always find these things quite amazing, but there was a court case and they were taken to court and they were found out to be the culprits who had murdered John Grayson, and their trial was in Chichester, and they were hanged for the crime on the Broil, which I believe is an area of Chichester, on the road onto Chichester. But the more interesting part of the story is that when the body of John Grayson was found, a young man in his 20s, maybe 30s at this point, was very interested and went to the site where the alleged murder or the hijacking or the whatever you want to call it on the boat, the theft took place. And there he searched high and low until he found the wooden leg in the bulrushes. And he took this, wrapped it under his coat so that no one would see it, and took it back to a cottage in South Stoke. There he lived with his mother, and he presented it to his mother on the table. And she looked shocked because she knew exactly whose leg this was. She was quite familiar with it, but not as familiar as the man or the young man was, for he remembered as a child running errands for John Grayson that on occasion he would discover John Grayson in the parlour with his leg off, looking in a small secret compartment. And there he found that compartment on the kitchen table in front of his mother, and from within inside produced 6 gold coins. Now, I don't know whether these were sovereigns or whether they were doubloons or what kind of coins they were. Philip Mercer doesn't actually say in the book, but it was enough to take out of destitution the mother and the son and make them have a much happier life thereon in. What an amazing and curious tale that Philip Mercer tells. These stories were said to him as he was a curate going around Sussex doing the Lord's job, and he put them all into a book. Anyway, I thought that might entertain you, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you have enjoyed it. Follow, like and subscribe, and no doubt over the Christmas period there might be a couple more of these stories from Philip Mercer's very remarkable and curious book of tales of Old Sussex. Till next time, bye-bye.